It's Christmas morning, 1962, and a boy is standing in the living room in his pajamas, staring at something long and thin leaning against a fireplace, wrapped in red paper with a bow on the barrel. He knows what it is before he touches it. You always know. He tears the paper away, and there it is, a Daisy Red Ryder, lever action, wood stock, the name burned right into the side. 21 inches long, looks exactly like a real rifle, and that's entirely the point. He pumps the lever once, feels the mechanism click, and something shifts in his chest, some combination of pride and weight, the first real sense that this object means something, that it requires something from him in return. His father hands him a tin of BBs and takes him outside, into the cold, into the backyard, and sets up a tin can on the fence post 20 feet away. He does not say, "Be careful." He says, "Watch your trigger finger, keep it pointed down, never point it at anything you don't mean to shoot. There are rules, real rules. And the rules mean something because the gun means something." That boy learned more about responsibility that Christmas morning than in a month of school. Because there was a time in America when giving a child a BB gun was not a controversy, it was a tradition. And then it became a question. This is the story of how that happened. Tell me in the comments where you grew up and whether you had one. If you ever had one, you remember the weight of it first. Not heavy, but not nothing either. Enough to feel real in your hands. Enough that you held it differently than you held a toy. You remember the smell of the wood stock, faintly oily, like something that meant business. You remember the sound of the lever cycling, that satisfying mechanical click-clack that meant it was loaded, that meant it was ready, that meant you had better be ready too. You remember the tin cans, the paper targets tacked to the fence, the way a BB would punch a clean hole through a soup can at 20 feet and leave a dent in the wood behind it. You remember the first time you actually hit what you were aiming at, the tiny metallic ping, the can spinning off the post, and the sensation that you had done something real, accomplished something that required skill and patience and stillness. And you remember being trusted with it. That is the part that stays with you. You were 10, maybe 12, and someone handed you that gun and trusted you to know the rules and keep them. That trust felt like growing up. It felt like being seen as someone who could be counted on. Most of the time, that trust was kept. Most of the time. Let's be clear about what a BB gun actually was, because the whole story depends on understanding it honestly. A Daisy air rifle was not a toy in the way a rubber ball is a toy. It fired a steel ball bearing at speeds ranging from 200 to nearly 400 feet per second, depending on the model and the year. At close range, it could break skin. It could put out an eye. It could, under the wrong circumstances, cause serious injury and even, in the rarest cases, kill. Daisy did not hide this. The manuals that came with the guns were explicit. Never point at a person. Never pump beyond the recommended number of times. Always treat it as loaded. Every rule was there because breaking it had a consequence, and that was, again, entirely the point. The BB gun occupied a precise middle ground that American culture had always understood. More than a toy, less than a firearm. Powerful enough to teach real respect, limited enough to allow a child to learn without catastrophic risk. It was a training tool for patience, for discipline, for the weight of consequence, sold as recreation. And for 80 years, that distinction held. Here's the claim, and the culture backed it up for generations. The Daisy BB gun alumni list reads like a cross-section of 20th century American manhood. Presidents, generals, hunters, writers, men who would later recall, without prompting, that their first experience with any kind of firearm was a Daisy in the backyard. Ernest Hemingway was given one as a boy and credited it with igniting his lifelong obsession with hunting and the outdoors. Countless military officers have written that they learned the fundamentals of marksmanship, patience, sight alignment, breath control, not in boot camp, but behind the garage at 10 years old. The Boy Scouts of America incorporated BB gun marksmanship into their programs. The NRA ran youth BB gun leagues across the country. High schools held competitions. The gun was not just accepted as a tool for teaching responsibility, it was formally institutionalized as one. For 3 generations of American boys, the Daisy was the first step in a deliberate process. Here is something that demands respect. Learn to give it that. Everything else follows. The story of the Daisy begins, improbably, with windmills. In the 1880s, a small ironworks company in Plymouth, Michigan, was struggling. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company made farm windmills, and business was unreliable. In 1886, one of their salespeople, a man named Clarence Hamilton, showed up at the factory with something he'd been tinkering with in his spare time, a crude air-powered rifle made mostly from scrap metal that shot a small steel ball bearing. The company president, Lewis Huff, fired it at a target and reportedly declared, "Boy, that's a Daisy." The meme stuck instantly, and so did the idea. The windmill company pivoted almost overnight. By 1895, they had reorganized entirely as the Daisy Manufacturing Company and moved away from windmills for good. It was one of the great accidental pivots in American industrial history. A company on the edge of failure stumbled into a product that would make it immortal, and in the process, it would spend the next century manufacturing not just a toy, but a ritual. The American backyard would never quite be the same. By the early 20th century, Daisy was not just a company. It was a monopoly on a childhood experience. They moved their operations to Rogers, Arkansas in 1958, and the town essentially became the company. At their peak, Daisy employed a significant portion of Rogers' working population, and the town's identity and the company's were nearly inseparable, a symbiosis that would last decades. They manufactured millions of guns per year, dominated the American market, and, crucially, kept their prices low enough that a Daisy was accessible to almost any family. The Red Ryder model, introduced in 1938, named after a popular Western comic strip cowboy, became the flagship. The lever-action design was deliberate. It looked and handled like a real Winchester rifle, giving boys the satisfaction of authenticity. Daisy licensed the Red Ryder name, put the cowboy's portrait right on the stock, and sold the gun as a piece of the American West available in any backyard. Between 1938 and the 1980s, they sold somewhere north of 9 million Red Ryders. 9 million for a single model. The BB gun was not a niche product. It was an American institution. And then, in 1983, the Daisy Red Ryder became something beyond a product. It became mythology. Gene Shepard's autobiographical novel about growing up in Indiana in the 1940s had been published years earlier, and it contained a scene every boy who had ever wanted a BB gun recognized instantly. The desperate campaign to convince parents of the one thing they most feared to give. When director Bob Clark adapted the book into A Christmas Story, the movie caught fire in a way no one predicted, and the Red Ryder became its beating heart. Ralphie Parker's obsession with a Red Ryder carbine action 200-shot range model air rifle and his parents' terrified response of, "You'll shoot your eye out, kid," was funny because it was true. Every family had lived that negotiation. The movie captured something real. The BB gun as the precise object where childhood ambition met parental anxiety, where wanting to be trusted collided with the fear of getting it wrong. The film is now broadcast continuously on Christmas Eve. The gun has been immortal ever since. And so has the warning. To understand why millions of families gave their children this thing, you have to understand what they believed they were giving them. They weren't giving them a weapon. They were giving them a curriculum. The BB gun was a structured introduction to a set of ideas that American culture considered foundational, that some things demand your full attention, that carelessness has physical consequences, that power, even modest power, carries obligation. The rules were not negotiable, and every boy knew them by heart. Never point it at a person. Treat it as loaded even when it isn't. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Always know what's beyond your target. These rules were not printed only in manuals, they were spoken out loud, father to son, older brother to younger, neighbor to neighborhood kid, every single time the gun came out. They were oral tradition. And the rules were self-enforcing in the way that only real consequences make possible. A BB gun pointed carelessly at a friend and fired, even accidentally, produced an injury immediate enough and painful enough to make the lesson permanent. The world pushed back. That was the mechanism. That was the education. Here is the fact that reframes everything. By the mid-1980s, Daisy estimated that BB gun-related eye injuries were occurring at a rate of somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 per year in the United States. Not deaths, eye injuries, a category ranging from minor to permanently blinding. And the vast majority were not from the careful, supervised backyard target shooting that parents imagined when they bought the gun. They were from exactly what you'd expect when you put a projectile weapon in the hands of unsupervised children. Pointing at friends, shooting at things they shouldn't, removing the safety, bypassing the rules. Thousands of eyes, every year. The American Academy of Pediatrics had been raising the alarm for years. Emergency rooms documented the injuries in detail, and the lawsuits began to accumulate. Parents of blinded children suing Daisy, suing retailers, arguing that the gun was inherently dangerous, that no amount of instruction could make it safe for children. This was not hysteria. These were real children with real injuries. The question, the genuinely hard question that the country was about to spend decades arguing, was not whether the injuries were real. It was what exactly they meant and what exactly should be done about them. Why did it take so long for the alarm to reach mainstream ears? Because a BB gun existed inside an American cultural consensus so powerful and so old that questioning it felt to many like questioning something foundational. The gun was tied in the minds of millions to hunting culture, to rural tradition, to military service, to the broadly held belief that teaching a boy to handle a weapon responsibly was part of making him a capable adult. And those millions were not wrong exactly. The boys who learned the rules and kept them, and they were the majority, really did learn something valuable. The problem was the boys who didn't, or couldn't, or weren't supervised closely enough, or who were simply unlucky in a moment of bad judgment. That gap between the education the gun provided when everything went right and the injury it caused when anything went wrong was always there. America had simply decided for 80 years that the first outweighed the second. In the 1980s and 1990s, it began to wonder if it had done the math correctly. Tell me in the comments, were you supervised with yours or were you out there on your own? Here's the truth at the center of the entire story. The truth that both sides of the argument kept talking past. The BB gun worked as an educational tool, precisely because it was real. It worked because the consequence of carelessness was a consequence you could feel. The weight of the gun in your hands, the sound of the mechanism, the small but genuine danger of what it could do. All of that was not a defect to be engineered away. It was the mechanism of the lesson. The moment the danger disappears, so does the lesson. A child who has only ever played with things that cannot hurt them does not learn how to be careful with things that can. That transfer does not happen automatically. It has to be taught. And the BB gun, at its best, taught it. What America was really arguing about in every courtroom and every legislature where BB guns were debated was a question much larger than the gun. How much real risk should childhood include? Who bears responsibility when that risk produces harm? And is trust itself, the act of handing a child something real and consequential, still something we are willing to offer?
The cultural ground under the BB gun had been shifting since the 1970s, and it accelerated in the 1980s for reasons that had nothing to do with the gun itself. American parenting was changing. The concept of stranger danger took hold. Helicopter parenting, intense, anxious, close supervision of children's every activity began its rise. Children's television was sanitized. Playgrounds removed their tall slides and metal merry-go-rounds and tall jungle gyms and replaced them with rubberized, low-to-the-ground plastic equipment that could not produce a serious injury. The word liability entered the vocabulary of every institution that dealt with children. And then the debate over gun violence in America, which had been building since the assassinations of the 1960s and erupted with each new mass shooting in the 1980s and 1990s, created an atmosphere in which any product resembling a firearm, even a children's air rifle, became politically and emotionally complicated in ways it had never been before. The BB gun had not changed. The country it existed in had.
The legal pressure arrived steadily, and each wave took something with it. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, a series of high-profile lawsuits against Daisy wound through the courts. Families of children who had been blinded, some by their own guns, some by a friend's, sued the company, argued the guns were defective, argued the warnings were insufficient, argued the products were being sold to an age group that could not reliably use them safely. Daisy fought many of these cases and won, but winning in court does not mean winning in public opinion, and the cumulative weight of the litigation reshaped the company's posture. Warnings became more prominent, packaging changed, age recommendations were raised and printed more clearly. Several retailers quietly stopped stocking BB guns in the toy aisle and moved them to the sporting goods section. A symbolic change with enormous practical impact. Being near the footballs and fishing poles sent a different message than being near the action figures. State legislatures began moving too. Age restrictions for purchasing BB guns tightened in several states. Some municipalities restricted them outright within city limits. The gun had not changed. Its legal and commercial environment had changed entirely around it. Daisy Manufacturing survived. It is still in business today, still making BB guns in Rogers, Arkansas. But the company that emerged from the 1990s was a diminished version of the institution it had been. The product line shrank. The marketing changed. Daisy stopped leaning into the Christmas morning rite of passage imagery that had driven decades of sales and moved toward more careful defensive messaging. Safety certificates, required adult supervision, clear age minimums. The guns themselves were redesigned with additional safety mechanisms. And the cultural infrastructure that had made the BB gun a ritual, the neighbor who taught the rules, the fathers who took sons to the backyard, the Boy Scout marksmanship programs, the oral tradition of the 4 rules, quietly frayed. As families moved more indoors, as backyards shrank, as supervised outdoor play declined, the context in which a BB gun made sense began to disappear. You can sell a gun. You cannot sell the backyard, the father, the afternoon, and the 40 years of cultural agreement that made the thing work. Without that context, a BB gun is just a projectile weapon marketed to children, and that is a much harder thing to defend. You can still buy a Daisy Red Ryder today. It looks almost exactly the same as it did in 1938. Same lever action, same wood stock, same cowboy branding. In that sense, nothing has changed. But everything has changed. The BB gun now sits in a legal and cultural landscape that treats it with a suspicion the original designers could not have imagined. It is regulated differently in nearly every state. It is absent from the toy aisles of major retailers who have made corporate decisions to stop selling it altogether. It is wrapped in warning labels and age restrictions and liability disclaimers. And the honest reckoning that this story demands, some of that is right. 3,000 to 4,000 eye injuries per year was not an acceptable toll. Some of those children were blinded permanently. That is not a lesson, it is a harm, and minimizing it required exactly the kind of attention that regulators and courts applied. But somewhere between take out the uranium and ban everything, America once again overshot. What we lost was not the gun. What we lost was the ritual, the trust, the shared understanding that a child, given something real and dangerous, with real rules and real supervision, could rise to meet it. We stopped believing that. And once you stop believing it, you cannot just believe it again. There was a time in America when a BB gun under the Christmas tree was not a debate. It was a red and green wrapped statement of faith. Faith that a child who was shown the rules and held to them would keep them. That the weight of a real thing in small hands was a teacher nothing else could replace. That trust given carefully is trust earned back. Millions of men grew up on that faith. They went on to be careful with other real things, with cars, with tools, with other people, with lives. The gun was the beginning of a longer education in consequence, and for most of them, it worked. And then the injuries piled up, and the lawyers arrived, and the culture turned, and the retailers backed away, and the ritual unraveled thread by thread until what was left was a product in a sporting goods case with 12 warning labels and an age restriction, and nobody's father standing behind it. We were right to remove the hazards that were genuinely too great. We were right to demand better safety mechanisms, better warnings, more supervision. But we did what we always do. We kept going. We stripped away not just the danger, but the trust, not just the risk, but the lesson. Not just the BB gun, but the whole idea that a child could be handed something real and counted on to respect it. The warning on the box always said you'll shoot your eye out. What it never said was that the fear of that outcome would one day cost us something we didn't know we were paying with. If you grew up with a Red Ryder, if you know the weight of it, the sound of it, the ping of a tin can at 20 feet on a cold morning, you already know what I mean. Subscribe, because there's another forgotten American story already waiting on the workbench.